then a perfect illustration of this strategy can be found in the Four Knights game. We reach this classical opening after the moves e4, e5. Both sides occupy the center and will then focus on supporting it by centralizing the knights with knight f3, adding pressure against the e5 pawn, and whether black plays knight f6, which is known as the Petrov defense, or if black chooses to play the classical knight c6. White has the same idea in mind, simply developing the other knight and controlling the center with knight c3, when black responds in kind with knight f6. We have now reached the Four Knights opening, an ancient opening that is well known for solid, straightforward development. This is generally regarded as a safety-first opening, but as we'll see, both sides will have the opportunity to sharpen the game if they should so choose. The first thing to explore is the natural developing move bishop c4. In response to this move, known as the Four Knights Italian variation, black can maintain the symmetry with bishop c5, leading to safe, quiet play. But black has the chance to unleash the center knight fork trick with knight takes e4, preparing to meet knight takes e4 with d5, forking white's bishop and knight, so black will regain the sacrificed material with a comfortable game. The term center knight fork trick suggests black has tricked white into surrendering the e4 pawn's control over the center, so the e5 pawn provides good central control for black. The natural bishop c4 allows the unpleasant center knight fork trick with knight takes e4. So what should white play instead? White sometimes plays g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop with bishop g2. This is known as the Gleck system. It's not considered a particularly challenging option, but it's certainly a positional system the interested viewer can explore. In response to the Gleck system, black can play the safe and solid bishop c5, simply focusing on active, natural development. If black would prefer to sharpen the game immediately, d5 is an interesting option to explore. In the Four Knights opening, the most popular method of developing the light-squared bishop is to play bishop b5. Bishop b5 creates tension against the knight on c6, the key defender of e5, so this move indirectly adds pressure against black's center. The direction of play largely depends on how black decides to respond. Knight d4 is known as the Rubinstein variation. It can lead to concrete lines in which black must be well familiar with the opening theory in order to neutralize white's play. This is seen at grandmaster level, especially when black is content with a draw. A far more natural and popular response is the straightforward bishop b4. This solid response may give us the impression that black only wants to maintain symmetry and minimize any potential complications, which may be the case, but both sides will have plenty of opportunities to create imbalances in the position. As the tension increases, it's important to understand if white relieves the tension and tries to win a pawn with bishop takes c6. Black has nothing to fear by responding with d takes c6, opening up the d-file for black's queen, as well as revealing a diagonal for black's light-squared bishop. If white decides to support the e-pawn with d3, then black can play a move such as queen e7, reinforcing the center with a solid game. If white continues with the plan of trying to win a pawn with knight takes e5, queen d4 is sometimes a plan, attacking the knight and e4 pawn, but since the c3 knight protects e4, white can simply play knight f3, attacking black's queen. A stronger response is to follow in the footsteps of Grandmaster Michael Adams and play bishop takes c3. If white plays d takes c3, this allows an exchange of queens, followed by knight takes e4, when Grandmaster Adams completely solved his opening problems. And if white responds with b takes c3, this is well met by knight takes e4. Black's point is that if white plays queen e2, preparing the trick of responding to knight f6 with knight takes c6 check, discovering the queen's attack against the king while attacking black's queen. Instead of allowing such a gift, black can centralize the queen with queen d5, supporting the knight on e4 while attacking white's knight. Black is ready to castle the king out of the center with a solid position. Rather than capturing the knight immediately, white can remain flexible by castling. Black can also maintain the symmetrical strategy by castling. White sometimes decides to play bishop takes c6, giving up the bishop pair in order to slightly compromise black's structure, but white's most popular continuation is d3, simply focusing on development and supporting the center. If black wants to break the symmetry, a sensible path to explore is bishop takes c3, giving up the bishop pair in order to double white's pawns on the c-file, creating a positional imbalance. Another choice is to simply focus on straightforward development with d6, supporting the center while opening up a diagonal for the light-squared bishop. If white decides to focus on direct play, then a natural follow-up is bishop g5, pinning the f6 knight to the queen, and preparing the unpleasant follow-up knight d5. It's important for black not to blindly follow white with the symmetrical bishop g4, as white can play bishop takes f6. It's a bad sign when black's best response is to voluntarily compromise the kingside structure with g takes f6, but in this case the alternatives are far worse. If black plays queen takes f6, this is well met by knight d5, attacking the queen, bishop, and unprotected c7 pawn. And if black wants to take the copycat strategy to the extreme, mimicking white's last move with bishop takes f3, this also leads to trouble after queen takes f3, queen takes f6. White finally breaks the symmetry once and for all with the exchange queen takes f6, g takes f6. Black's kingside pawn structure has been compromised, and white can intensify the pressure with knight d5. White's knight attacks both the unprotected f6 and c7 pawns, as well as the dark-squared bishop. Black is in serious trouble. The symmetrical approach leads to highly unpleasant positions for black, and knight d5 is an annoying threat. This is a good moment for black to break the symmetry and imbalance the position with bishop takes c3, doubling white's pawns after b takes c3. After compromising white's pawn structure, it may appear black is still under some nagging pressure, especially as the pin against the f6 knight appears quite annoying. One instructive maneuver to keep in mind is queen e7. It may seem a bit strange to develop your queen, especially as it does not appear to help resolve the pin against the f6 knight. The four knights game can lead to subtle, positional maneuvering, and this is precisely the case here. The queen vacates the d8 square to allow the instructive maneuver knight d8, preparing to challenge white's dark-squared bishop and centralize the knight with knight e6. White's dark-squared bishop will not be able to maintain the tension against the knight. If white responds to knight e6 with bishop h4, trying to maintain the pin, black can play the maneuver knight f4 to g6, attacking the dark-squared bishop and unpinning the knight. White typically continues with rook e1, supporting e4, and preparing to expand in the center with d4, when a positional struggle with mutual chances can be expected. In one high-level encounter, rather than playing the direct bishop g5, former world champion Viswanathan Anand demonstrated that there can be a lot more to the four knights than meets the eye. Instead of allowing bishop takes c3, he decided to play knight e2. The knight clears the c3 square for future central expansion with c3, followed by d4. The knight on e2 seeks greater activity on the king's side with a future knight g3. His opponent, Grandmaster Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, responded in kind with knight e7. White continued with c3, gaining a tempo against the bishop and preparing to expand in the center with d4. Black decided to retreat the bishop with bishop a5, when white improved the position of his knight and supported the e4 pawn with knight g3. Black has the chance to play a timely c6, gaining a tempo against the enemy bishop, provoking bishop a4 prior to playing knight g6, an interesting option worth exploring. In the game, black decided to play the sensible knight g6, when white continued with his plan by expanding in the center with d4. Since black's dark-squared bishop is looking quite passive on a5, black decided to improve its position and add pressure against white's center with bishop b6. White responded with the sensible rook e1, supporting the center when black challenged white's bishop with c6. Since black did not play c6 before white was able to advance the d3 pawn to d4, this allowed Anand to play bishop d3. The bishop enjoys great flexibility on d3, supporting e4, as well as pointing toward black's king side, while also observing the queen side. Although black's position remains relatively solid, white has achieved his opening objectives. He enjoys greater central space with the potential to exert long-term positional pressure with his slightly more active pieces. This strategy was quite successful in the game, leading to an impressive victory for white. Bishop b4 is a solid and popular way to respond to the four knights. If black wants to provoke immediate action, then black can play in the style of legendary 19th century American master Paul Morphy with bishop c5. Black focuses on active, rapid development. The tactical point behind this move is that white cannot immediately win a pawn with bishop takes c6, as this plan will backfire after d takes c6. Once again, black captures with the d-pawn, opening up the d-file for the queen. If white tries to win a pawn with knight takes e5, it's important for black to avoid playing the tempting queen d4, threatening the knight on e5, as well as checkmate on f2. Unfortunately for black, this does not work out well thanks to the response knight d3, defending against checkmate while securing the knight, which also attacks the bishop on c5, when white is able to get away with the premature pawn capture on e5. In order to punish white's premature pawn grab, black can double attack the e5 and f2 squares in a more forcing manner, with the tactical shot bishop takes f2 check, capturing a pawn while disrupting white's king safety, preparing to meet king takes f2. With the double attack, queen d4 check, forking the king and knight, regaining the material with a comfortable game, so white's premature pawn grab has backfired. In response to bishop c5, white's most popular choice is to castle. This flexible move secures the king as well as the f2 square, and waits to see how black will continue. If black supports the center with d6, this pins the knight on c6 to the king, allowing white to strike in the center with d4, building an early initiative. This means that black will usually castle. Now that black can play d6 without pinning the knight on c6 in the process, white has to make an important decision. A move such as d3 is a solid, although not particularly ambitious choice. White may explore the option to provoke a structural imbalance with bishop takes c6, but another interesting choice is to play the disruptive knight takes e5. Now it's white's turn to unleash the center knight fork trick. Paul Morphy won a classic game after rook e8, a dynamic option to explore, but black's most common response is knight takes e5, allowing white to fork the knight and bishop with d4. Black decides to preserve the dark-squared bishop with bishop d6. Although d takes e5 is possible, a stronger option is to grab more space with f4. Black's knight escapes the pressure in the center with knight e to g4, supporting the other knight on f6. International master Mark Esserman, playing white, advanced his mobile pawn center forward with e5, forking the knight and bishop. Bishop b4 is an active option to explore, but in this game Grandmaster Korneev preferred bishop e7, supporting the knight while clearing a path for the d-pawn to advance. White continued to remain patient before regaining the sacrifice material and played bishop e2, intensifying pressure against the knight on g4, so black revealed the second defender for this piece while attacking the center with d6. h3 is a useful move to investigate, but white decided to collect material with e takes f6. Knight takes f6. White enjoys a space advantage, while black enjoys a more solid pawn structure. The chances are somewhat balanced, although the experienced grandmaster went on to win the game as black. As we conclude our initial tour of the Four Knights opening, it's worth noting that white may challenge black's center immediately with d4. White intensifies the pressure against the e5 pawn, so black should initiate the exchanges e takes d4, knight takes d4. Bishop c5 is one option to explore, but black's most popular response is the active bishop b4. Pinning the knight on c3, indirectly attacking the e4 pawn. Beginners to this opening sometimes react to this threat with bishop d3, hanging the knight on d4. This is why white should first play knight takes c6, compromising black's structure after b takes c6. After the exchange of knights, white is ready to support the center with bishop d3. Striking in the center immediately with d5 is a strong choice, and black may also delay this by a move, preferring to castle. Attacking the knight with e5 is premature, as black can simply pin this pawn to the king with rook e8. This is a good moment for white's king to also exit the center by castling. When black strikes in the center with the thematic d5, lunging forward with e5 is well met by knight g4, so white usually plays e takes d5, c takes d5. Former world champion Vladimir Kramnik has played the subtle h3, when this is well met by rook e8, taking over the e-file with interesting play. White's traditional response has been the straightforward bishop g5, pinning the knight, the key defender of the d5 pawn. So black typically reinforces the d5 pawn with c6. White has several options at this point, but a good place to start your investigation is with queen f3, intensifying the pressure against the pinned knight while connecting the rooks on the back rank. Black can decide to support the knight with bishop e7, and it's worth noting that black sometimes prefers to play bishop d6, a more active diagonal for the bishop, not fearing multiple exchanges on the f6 square, a strategy which has proven quite reliable for black. Overall, the Four Knights Scotch isn't considered a particularly challenging line, but as this line provokes structural imbalances, it can certainly reward the more experienced and strategically minded player. The Four Knights.
Subscribe for like more videos.